Explore the history, relationships, expertise, and data that go into ensuring Stine growers get maximum yield potential. This is the Stine Seedcast. Here's your host, David Thompson.
Hello, and welcome to the Stine Seedcast. I'm David Thompson, National Marketing and Sales Director for Stine Seed Company. Today, our guest on the Seedcast is Paige Tuggle, Regional Sales Agronomist for Stine. Thanks for joining us, Paige.
Thank you, David.
So today's conversation is part of our new series on the Seedcast called Agriculture Around the U.S. Our goal with this is to bring listeners agronomic information from all of Stine's territories. So be on the lookout for more episodes of this series in the future. Now, in Paige's case, she oversees Region 15 for Stine, which is the state of Michigan. She provides resources to her sales team and helps them meet the needs of growers and set them up for success in the field. Paige is here today to share her observations of corn and soybean production in the area, as well as agricultural practices and crop selection influences. Paige is joining us remotely from her home office in Ithaca, Michigan. So, let's get started. Well, so Paige, again, thanks for joining us on the podcast and joining us to talk about agriculture from your point of view. Before we get into that, I guess I always like to ask a little bit about your background. Tell us about your background. Tell us about where you're from and your history and how you came to be with Stine.
Well, thanks, David. I grew up in a little rural town of Ithaca, Michigan, and other than going to college, I've lived here my whole life. And this is where my parents decided to start their farm. So they purchased some land here of about 40 acres and raised my sister and I. And during high school, I got involved with FFA and served as an officer every year of high school and went on to receive my state degree and went on to receive the national degree after that. The whole time growing up, we raised cattle, Black Angus cattle on our farm. And so that led us to showing, and we showed cattle across the nation. Was very competitive with that, won lots of shows and met a lot of people across the world. And I just feel like that always is, you find out how small the agricultural community is. And you always end up knowing somebody. So that got me into going to Michigan State for my college career. And something a little different about me that always surprises people is I actually attended Michigan State on a pre-med program. And I did not want to be involved in agriculture when I started. I wanted to go do something different. I've always been kind of a rebel, my dad says. And I kept finding myself being drawn back. I got a job at the beef barn there at the college, at the university, and found myself being pulled back into the agricultural community and wanted to come home on the weekends and help dad on the farm, wanted to be friends with people who were going into the ag industry. So I decided, that wasn't the route I wanted to take. I did not want to be in the medicine anymore and ended up transferring to Ferris State, where I ended up getting a business management degree and then started my journey into ag industry. So I was selling insurance for a little while for Farm Bureau. And I was finding myself in the office too much. So I then pursued a career in the ag retail and did that for a few years. And this opportunity with Stine came along. And what drew me to Stine was being out with the people, being out with the growers. The ag retail world, I was very involved with the growers and what they were doing every day and what their practices were. Well, I had to stay in one location. When I was presented with this opportunity with Stine and later hired as an RSA, I was able to be out with the growers and in the fields and seeing firsthand how things were being used and how they were being affected, such as the chemistries and the seed that we were putting in. I felt like that was more my style. Since then, I've just been helping my family on the farm. I own about a third of the herd now, and we farm about 200 acres that we do rotational crops on. And then also we have about 200 acres of rented ground for our hay that we grow and harvest as well.
Well, and thanks for sharing your story. And it's interesting, I think, for a lot of your story probably is paralleled by a lot of farm kids. I've interviewed several over the years who have that same idea that maybe there's another horizon, but it almost takes one step away to realize how much agriculture means to you, and you come back. And again, I've heard that on more than one occasion. I think it's an interesting element of life in agriculture. So, as a regional sales agronomist for Stine, tell us about how do you define what you do for Stine in the area that you work?
Well, the great thing about working for Stine is every day is not the same. We take one day at a time here, and it's some days I'm out there with the ISRs and we're making prospect calls and we're trying to grow their business. And then some days we're out in the fields trying to diagnose issues that the grower is seeing, whether it's seed related or not, whether it's a chemistry or a weather or possibly a disease that's gotten into that field. Just being out there with those ISRs and helping them grow their business is my main objective, helping them supply solutions to the growers as well.
In my travels, I've had the opportunity to visit Michigan a number of times. It's a beautiful state. There's so many great things happening there. From your perspective, when you think about, obviously as a seed company, we're focused on corn and soybean, but what makes corn and soybean production in Michigan maybe a bit unique compared to other parts of the country?
So Michigan, as most people know, is surrounded by lakes. We're called the Great Lakes State. And that impacts our industry immensely. We tend to have cooler climates here and very high humidity. You get a little different type of growing program, I would say. These growers have a very diverse crops that they grow. We have very numerous crops. So we have sugar beets and dry beans and wheat and potatoes and fruits. We're the fifth largest in the nation for apple production. And the dairies are also still thriving as well here in Michigan. So with all those diverse and specialty crops, growing corn and soybeans, growers are always looking at the different crop rotations that they have, and they have to design their program around that. So we have different chemistries that we use here in Michigan. We can't necessarily spray some HPPDs and some herbicides that others would have no problem using in other states. They've got to constantly be thinking of what's going to be in that next rotation or possibly what their neighbors have. They don't want to spray something that could impact what their neighbors are growing. So they kind of have always got to have a little different program than what other states have.
You mentioned climate, and I think that's one of the things I think is particularly unique about Michigan, and certainly you have other states that from a latitude perspective are similar, Wisconsin and Minnesota, your neighbors across the pond there. But again, as you said, you're in a unique spot where being between the lakes, I think certainly does cause a different climactic situation there. Is that fair to say?
So with that, we have a lot cooler air. Also, a lot more cloud coverage. So Michigan has one of the highest cloud coverage days of the year. We have a lot less heat units coming from that sun. With that impacts how the corn and soybeans will grow. Soybeans are very influential to that daylight and how many hours. And then that corn, if we don't have enough heat units, it just won't thrive as well. But also in the same sense, we have that humidity, that corn likes that humidity in the air. And different things like that is what impacts those crops on a daily basis. Also, our weather is impacted by those states. We don't tend to have what I would call a catastrophic weather conditions, such as maybe out in the Midwest where you have more tornadoes and more hail and more catastrophic weather issues. Those Great Lakes will protect us, and we just don't generally get those big episodes. Usually that's towards the southern part of the state. This year we've had 2 E1, EF1 tornadoes. Those are very tiny compared to what are out in the Midwest, So, but those were in the southern part of the state. So, where those lakes aren't protecting us. So that weather is greatly impacted by how those lakes are surrounded.
You mentioned just a sampling of some of the other crops that are grown in Michigan. And again, you have a host of other things. So how does corn and soybean production play into, in particular, some of those? And I don't want to call them necessarily specialty crops, but they are as it relates to row crop production, they're a little bit different than, let's say, general corn and soybean production. So as growers in your area are working on their crop plans, what role does corn and soybean play relative to some of those other crops?
One thing that's unique to Michigan is we don't necessarily always use 30-inch rows spacings like a lot of the rest of the nation does. We'll use more 15-inch rows. And that is because of the fact that things such as sugar beets, they need to be planted on 28-inch rows. So they'll use the 15-inch rows to help offset the next round when they plant sugar beets in that field. So with these other crops being grown, the growers have to constantly be thinking, I'm growing corn this year, but how does that impact next year's crop rotation? And also, what kind of herbicides and HPPDs do we put on there? What kind of chemistry program are we going to use this year that will work with next year's crop rotation? And also, just because I have this type of soil in this field, I could have something 100% different in a field that's on the other side of the section. So they have to grow a lot of diverse maturities, and different maturities due to different soil will impact how that crop is grown.
Oh, okay.
This maturity might work really well in sandy ground, but that doesn't mean it's going to work across a section where I've got silt or I've got more of a swampy type soil. So the growers have to have a diverse portfolio, if you will, of what they're planting. They can't just plant all the same just because they want to harvest at the same time.
You made mention there about, for example, row spacing. That is something that's been impacted in Michigan by the variety of different crops that are grown. So that's a good example of a cultural practice change that actually plays into some of what we've been talking about for a long time, which is different row spacing and moving toward narrow row spacing. But are there other decisions that get informed that impact how corn and soybeans are grown in the area beyond even like row spacing?
Yeah, so back to like the chemistry standards. You don't want to apply something to the corn and soybeans that next year, the sugar beets might not like, or the wheat. We have a lot of wheat grown. So something that the residuals can be left in the ground can impact that next year. And also timing. Timing is a big thing too here. If you want to plant wheat in the fall, then you need to be thinking about what kind of soybeans you want to plant that previous spring. You need to be able to our weather tends to get cold and wet in the fall. So if you can't get the soybeans off in a timely manner, you're not going to be able to plant that wheat in the fall and have enough time. And same with the corn. They constantly need to be thinking about when they want to harvest that corn, if they're going to chop the corn for silage or if they're going to harvest it with grain. Well, if it gets cold and it gets wet, you might not be able to get that corn off in a timely manner. So, how's your fall? You got to figure out in the spring how your fall's going to look in Michigan.
Get out the crystal ball. So you mentioned a little bit about interaction with soil type as it relates to product selection. And given your geography, I guess I'm curious. Of course, no part of this planet is just a homogeneous type of soil, but some are more variable than others. I guess what's it like in Michigan as you travel, north to south and east to west? I mean, is it a big range or is it fairly similar?
So Michigan is a peninsula, and a lot of it is sandy. A lot of Michigan will be sandy ground, but you get towards what we call the thumb area, which is the Saginaw Valley, Bay City area. We call that the rich soil. That's typically where the majority of our high-yielding crops are grown. That's some good black dirt, great soil for corn and soybeans. That's kind of the heart of the state and where a lot of it's grown. Now you get over to the western side of the state, that is more known for fruit growth. A lot of fruit is grown on the western side of the state, and that's because of the type of soils that are over there. Like the fruits can grow better over there, and they get that lake effect weather as well. We do have a lot of corn over there. We've been very successful with the Stine corn over in that area as well. So Michigan just we have sand, and then we have some heavy dirt. You could go from one side of a section to another side of a section, and it could be 100% different.
Well, like I said, the one thing that seems to be a constant is variability in soil. No matter where you are in the world, it tends to vary. Thinking about corn and soybean production in your state, you obviously get a chance to talk to your agronomy team and you talk to other RSAs and other parts of our trade area. And I guess, is there anything that sticks out to you that defines maybe the difference in corn and soybean production in your area relative to maybe what you've seen in some of the neighboring areas?
So in Michigan, we still have a very high rate of dairy farms growing. This has led us to do more silage research than what others may do in other states. I tend to talk to growers more about how our particular corn hybrids would do for silage usage. And a lot of them need silage usage, but then they also want the grain from it as well to sell. So we need to have a diverse portfolio as far as the corn hybrids as well. Also, with those soybeans in Michigan, it stays cooler. They're not going to be as tall as in other states, and that seems to be a little different for us.
So you mentioned earlier about that, about cloud cover and some of that and how it impacts soybeans. So I guess I'm curious, would you say that for a given latitude, do you think that in Michigan you plant maybe a slightly earlier soybean than you would in Minnesota or Wisconsin or something at the same given latitude?
Yeah, we're seeing anywhere in Michigan, we're usually seeing anywhere from 1.2, and we might get as long as a 2.5. Some guys really on the border down south will try a 2.7. But that's getting a little long. We tend to have them shorter maturities. It used to be that corn was always planted first and soybeans was always planted second with most growers in the state. We're now seeing a trend, the growers trying to get those soybeans in the ground as soon as possible and really pushing that limit just so they can get the most amount of days of that growth in that soybean with the falls being more cooler and with the climate change as well. You're seeing that cooler temperature come earlier. So they're trying to push the limit and trying to figure out when the earliest they can get that soybean in the ground.
Yeah, when soybeans are so dependent on daylight, it seems a shame that the summer equinox happens so early in the summer.
And here in Michigan, it's sunlight is few and hard between.
So something else you just mentioned a minute ago was about silage, and that's something that I think is certainly an interesting topic, and especially with your background in livestock management, I'm sure that probably helps when you go to talk to your customers about their needs for silage. And so tell me a little bit about, are there particular attributes about Stine corn that lend itself to silage applications?
So a great thing about Stine corn is that it does really well with planting in the cooler temperatures. That doesn't seem to hinder it at all. So you do get that emergence quick, and it can withstand being planted in that cool, wet ground. And the silage guys really enjoy that because they're not having hesitation in that corn. It's emerging out of the ground. It's as soon as they plant it, it's up and running. It's more efficient, and they're having to put less costs into maintaining that corn. With silage, you want to be able to grow that corn as efficient as possible. Stine does a great way, and we've done a lot of research in selecting very efficient corn, and the silage guys are really enjoying that and seeing more benefits to using the Stine corn.
Well, so it seems to me like in an area where there is probably a little higher propensity for narrow row planting, meaning sub 30-inch row, and again, the desire for more efficient corn production, it seems like there's certainly could be a real fit there for a lot of our hybrids in the area. So thinking about as we look ahead to this next year, what are things that you and your team of ISRs are working on to help growers address some of the ways that they're trying to improve their profitability, improve their operation? I think at the outset you mentioned helping provide solutions for farmers. So what way do you and your team work to provide those solutions?
So a great thing with having 10 reps now across the state is we were able to put in the most amount of PDP plots this year than we ever have before, and also more spread out across the state. So we will have plots in just about any kind of soil type that we have here in Michigan. With that, we have more lines and varieties and hybrids in each plot than ever before. This is allowing us to see that research firsthand and see how those varieties and hybrids are growing locally to those local growers. The growers like to see how that's working and how well it's doing in something that's close to them. They don't want to know how a plot is doing 3 states away because that does not affect them. That's not real life to them. They like seeing that research that's close to home. They like seeing how well that's doing and how it would do basically in their backyard. So we're pretty excited about that, and we plan to be continuing to walk those plots and seeing how that research develops.
So besides the product development plots, is there anything else going on, here this summer that has you particularly excited looking ahead to, the 2025 season?
Also, we participate in what we call Agro Expo. So it's a statewide invitation for all growers to attend. We'll have a nice plot there as well, where everybody can come and take a look and see how well it's doing with some experimentals in there. And also just the advancement of the research program and how these ISRs can get out there and see the work in their own fields.
Yeah, so I imagine growers in Michigan who are interested in learning more about the products can visit you at Agro Expo, or as you mentioned earlier, there'll be a number of plot days, maybe around these product development plots or dealer plot days. Anywhere else that they can go to learn more about the products and the information from Stine?
Yes, there'll be a lot of plot days that they'll be invited to, and we also invite all, even if you're not a grower of Stine, to attend as well. And we always like to, publish the research and advocate on how the ISRs do a great job of explaining everything to all the growers.
Well, last question for you, Paige. We've had a great conversation. I've learned a lot about your home state. We can't, not excluding corn and soybeans, which of course are the coolest crop out there. But if you don't count those, what's the coolest crop in the state of Michigan?
I personally like the grape program we have here in Michigan. So Michigan has some of the nation's most known wine selection. So, like California, and we have the ability to grow some of the sought out grape selections that vineyards like to have. And that's a very large production here in Michigan. So that always interests me a lot, and I like to visit different grape farms. One of our ISRs, actually, his in-laws own a vineyard, and it's always really interesting to see all the different types of varieties that are involved in things such as wine or grape juice or whatever they're trying to grow that grape for. It's very interesting.
And talk about an entirely different type of agriculture. That's a whole nother level right there.
Yes.
So we just call Michigan the California of the upper Midwest then. Maybe they don't want, I don't know. Maybe that's not what you want it to be. Anyway, Paige, it's been great to have you on, learn more about your state of Michigan and the things you're doing with you and your team to provide solutions for the farmers in your home state of Michigan. Again, thanks for joining us on the Seedcast today.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it. It was a good time.
Well, that's our time for today. I want to thank our guest and our listeners for joining us on another episode of the Stine Seedcast. We'll be back again soon with more expert interviews and insights about all things Stine. If you have a question for our Stine experts, send us an email at asktheseedcast@stineseed.com. That's asktheseedcast@stineseed.com. And to never miss an episode, subscribe to the Stine Seedcast wherever podcasts are found.
Subscribe to the Stine Seedcast wherever podcasts are found. To learn more about Stine and its elite corn and soybean genetics, visit stineseed.com. Stine has yield.